Going all the way back now to 2007, the very last state capitulated to only teach humanist evolution. In fact, the textbooks that used to have for 20 years, the little stickers on them in science class that warned everyone that evolution was a theory, were then taken off as of 2007. Countless Christian teachers, I've talked to many of them, have resigned because they simply say, I can't teach and say the things to the children that I want to say as a follower of Christ. And of course, now in California, everyone's aware they've mandated, our legislator, sexually graphic education for students as young as kindergarten. And now there's a new bill that seeks to remove parental notification when a child wants to adjust or supposedly change their gender. And Joe Biden, our president, now wants children to begin state education by age 3. Give me the schools, and you'll give me the world. You know who said that? Adolf Hitler. See, for 3 generations now in this country, children have been taught that right and wrong is meaningless. For 3 generations now in this country, children have been taught that they're nothing but a wart in an uncaring cosmos. For 3 generations now, children in this country have been taught that their dreams and their aspirations are really going to amount to nothing, and that even objective truth will only damn them. And the numbers are in. 80% of evangelicals will walk away from the Christian faith by their freshman year in college. The numbers are in. Only 7% of students coming out of evangelical homes will graduate the public school system calling themselves a Christian. And the numbers are in. As bad as that is, still 90% of evangelical parents put their children in state public schools. Never mind the one New Testament command given to Christian parents. Raise them in the discipline and the instruction, finish it with me, of the Lord. You got 12 little years to make sure that the Lord is put in front of that little mind. Not that you can save his soul, that's between he or she and God, but you make sure that he meets God. And you got 12 years to do it. And listen, it's not grandmother's job, and it's not the Sunday school teacher's job, and according to Scripture, it's not Elijah Kim's job in the youth ministry, and it sure is not the government's job. 100% beyond a shadow of a doubt in God's Word, it says it is the parent's job. So this morning, I'd like to ask you to open your Bible with me. Turn with me to the Older Testament, to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I want to take you back to really what we would call the Magna Carta on the home. And I want to show you basically, this is a summary passage that takes a lot of the best scriptures and truths from God on this subject, and Moses puts them all together. And I just want to walk you through these really clear commands for parents when it comes to how your child's mind is trained. And obviously, if you've been around church a long time, I know this is a pretty initiated group. You understand that the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible are written by Moses. And what you have here is basically in Deuteronomy a second giving of the law. And the reason for that was the first generation now is dying off. And they were the ones who'd seen the miracles of God. They had seen, God free them from Egypt. They had seen God through thunder and lightning appear to Moses up there on Mount Sinai. But they've now all died. And here you have the second generation that's about to go in and take the promised land. And what Moses does is he stands up, and in probably 2 or 3 sermons, maybe one really long one, he kind of reminds them, when you go into the promised land against all the paganism and all the prosperity, here's how you're going to stay different. Here's how you don't end up looking like them. And so this morning, we'll just study a few verses here to really anchor in on the Christian home. The home, the framework that provides a biblical worldview. So let's start reading there in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1. Moses says, "Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you are going over to possess, so that you and your son and your grandson might fear the Lord your God, to keep all of his statutes and his commandments, which I'm commanding you all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it, that it may be well with you and that you may multiply greatly, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in the land flowing with milk and honey." And then verse 4 is where we'll begin. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord Yahweh is our God, Elohim. The Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all of your might." And if you're a note taker this morning, we'll just put it right up there on the screen for you. The foundation here to this whole thing, and we'll talk to the parents here in a second, but the foundation, we could almost call it just the life curriculum that God, through Moses, wants Israel to make sure every home believes and holds to. The core curriculum, there it is on the screen, thank you very much, must be God. The core, people talk about the core all the time, right? That was the cool thing for a while. The core. For God's people, the core curriculum in those little lives for 12 years is to be God. It's interesting here, if you look at verse 4 again, he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God." And it's really a play on words there. You know, your Elohim, which would have been the word they used for all the little gods in the promised land, the land of Canaan. He says, your Elohim is Yahweh. That's the personal covenant name of God. Because they're about to go into the land where there's going to be all these gods. Basically, the Canaanites had a god for everything. You can still dig them up. Archaeologically, there's a statue here, a statue there, a statue here, a statue everywhere, right? So what he says here is he says, they have gods for everything, but you have the God who is everything. That's the play on words. They have gods for everything, but you have the God, you have the one God, and he is everything. And that's really the heartbeat here of this text. The foundation for biblical parenting, the life curriculum, has to center on that family unit loving God. Now listen closely. He's not just saying here, you need to take your kids to Sunday school. He's not just saying here, you need to make sure that they're in youth ministry. You need to make sure they get to VBS a couple times. And oh, by the way, if you pop in a few of those Odyssey CDs, you've really nailed it. That's not what he's saying. The terminology that he uses here in verse 5 is it needs to be, remember that term we used a few weeks ago, the heart? Meaning the will center, meaning the chief affections, meaning the innards and the kidneys, right? The idea is the very center of everyone's heart needs to be steered towards God, needs to love by choice, by will, Yahweh. That's the terminology that he uses here. It's right there in verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and soul, and then even adds in with all of your might, your resources. It's an all-in, no rivals worship and training in that home. Now, the reason that's important is because how a child, you ready, views God shapes how they view the world. Now, I'll just give you an example, right? If right now we pull up a couple teenagers and we put them right here. So picture 14, they probably have a hoodie on and they come walking up here, right? And I say, hey, who's God? Who's God? The answer that they give tells you everything about them. Because if you tell me what you believe about God, then I'm going to know what you believe about man and what you believe about truth and what you believe about ethics. We call that a worldview. What you believe about God is going to be the indicator of who you are in every other field of your life. Finish it with me. Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of what? Of wisdom. Do you hear that? That's Solomon telling his little son Rehoboam, listen, the fear of the Lord, the reverence of the Lord, knowing the Lord, understanding that he's Lord, bowing to him as Lord, that's the very beginning of your development as a young man. That's where it all starts. That's your worldview. That's what we're talking about here, is a worldview. Because not only does your child's view of God going to shape how they view the world, Also, it's going to shape, ready, how they stand out from the world, how they don't buy into the culture. Because you remember what's happening to the Israelites? They're going to go across that little river, and they're going to be in the middle of pagan prosperity. They're going to have a bunch of gross stuff right in front of them, and the temptation is they're going to want to look just like it. He says, no, no, no. If your family is constantly immersed in who God is, that will distinguish you from the culture around you. Now, one of the reasons, by the way, here on this, one of the reasons, listen closely, that the church is struggling right now, and youth pastors are struggling right now, and we call it a culture war. You hear that all the time. The reason there's a culture war is you have this group of people who are on the older side, right? They call them Zoomers and Boomers. Have you heard that? There's like the Boomer versus the Zoomer. Okay, some of you haven't heard that. If you're old, you haven't heard that because you're the Boomer and you're not on the Zoomer, right? So you have this generation that was raised with the Judeo-Christian worldview. You got this whole other one coming up, and they weren't. So now you got the older generation, and they're pounding the pulpit, on abortion and on transgender and homosexuality, like I've been doing the last few weeks. But then they're frustrated because the kids aren't getting it, right? Because they're trying to tell these kids to be something, ready, that they aren't. That makes sense? They keep preaching out all the fruit, entirely missing the root that these kids, since the time they were in 2, have been in a public school system telling them there is no God and they can do whatever they want based on instinct. And then the youth group comes in and goes, no, actually you need to do X, Y, and Z. And they go, what? Why? I mean, think about it this way. Right now, let's pretend we brought 2 13-year-olds from our youth group. We brought them up here and we put them. So who are they going to be? Let's see. Who should they be? I got to pick some names. Okay. We'll see. Let's see. Who should I pick? I don't know. We'll have Tom is one of them. And then Matthew. Matthew, you'll be the other one. Okay. So one kid's taller than the others. All right. So let's just pick 2 teens. We bring them in here. I want you to think about something as basic as, for example, the Grand Canyon. Okay. Everyone here knows what the Grand Canyon is, right? What's the Grand Canyon? Let's ask one of our 12-year-olds, the kid who was raised in the public school. Well, it's this grand expression of Mother Nature. And after 30 million years, 300 million years, we get to see Mother Nature's ingenious crafting by chance. And I, as part of an evolutionary species of protoplasm, have the privilege of going to witness it as I stand upon that crystal bridge. And then I pass off the beauties of Mother Nature to the next line in the species before I die back into nothingness. Oh, okay. And then you go over here and you ask Matthew, the other guy, right, who's been raised by his mother with the Judeo-Christian worldview in the Bible for the last 12 years. And he goes, nah, bro. He goes, actually, it's not a Grand Canyon at all. It's a gouge canyon. And everyone's like, huh? He goes, yeah, because there was a perfect creator God, but mankind ruined it in all of his rebellion. So God actually sent a flood, and he wiped this whole thing to pieces. And what you're looking at in a Grand Canyon, that's just a gouge in the ground, a remnant of what used to be. And oh, by the way, that creator God who made it and the creator God who ruined it and broke it is the same creator God who's going to come back and fix it. Oh, and he's the creator God who self-disclosed himself in the Word so that you as a young man could know who he was, bend your knee, have a purpose in this life and a hope in the next one. You know what I'm saying? Now, I want you to think about that. Just answer the question, Proverbs 1:7. Which one of the 12-year-olds has actual wisdom by age 13? Which one has real understanding by age 13? The Bible speaks clearly on education. And to parents, and this hit me the other night. I was with I was coming home from a meeting here really late. And I got home, it was around 9 o'clock, and I go up the stairs, and there on the outside, our little porch, one of my children was sitting and kind of talking out loud and reading their Bible out loud. So I walked by, I said, hey, everything okay, and this particular child said, I'm just wrestling again. I said, wrestling with what? He said, Matthew, they said Matthew 16:24. Matthew 16:24. Man, it always gets me, I'm like, yeah, it gets me too, right? And I'm pretending like I know what it was, and then I'm like, I think I know what it is. And he says, yeah, because Jesus was so clear. I said, he was. He said, yeah. If you want to come to me, Jesus said, you got to deny yourself. And you got to take up your cross and follow me. And he goes on, and he says, hey, he's not mincing words there. So every single day of my life, I've got a choice to make. I'm either going to deny myself and pick up my cross and follow him, or I'm not. I got some choices to make. I literally said, hey, listen, your mama's work and my work, it's done. I can be your coach, I can be your friend. But if that's the way that you're viewing life as you take off and you head into this world, my work is done. That's a biblical worldview. There is a God, and you have a choice to make. Did you know, you ready, parents? This is why it's so important. You can't save your kids, but you can put God in front of your kids. Here's why it's so important. This is a biblical worldview. Children who graduate with a biblical worldview, you ready for these numbers? Are 11 times less likely to be involved in adultery, 15 times less likely to be involved in homosexuality, 18 times less likely to be involved in drunkenness, right? 30 times less likely to be involved in shacking up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. Get this, 100 times less likely to ever have an abortion. So take salvation out of that. That's between God and them. Just putting a biblical worldview in front of your child allows them to be a moral and upstanding citizen. Now he gets into the how-tos. Look at this right here in verse 6. So he moves from the core curriculum for 12 years, being all about Yahweh. And then in verse 6, he goes on, and you can write this in your notes here, kind of point number 1 for the parents. The parents must maintain their biblical worldview. So you just start there in verse 6. Now we're moving into the how-to, right? He says in verse 6, these words which I am commanding you today, read it with me, shall be on what? So no one's reading with me. Overflow, you over there? The people in here don't care. Shall be on your heart. So he moves right here to the house. Step number 1, ensuring curriculum hits our kids, the God curriculum, ready, is to guard ourselves. He says it's got to be on your heart. Make sure it's on your heart. It's seared on your will. This is your worldview. Now I'm going to pause here. Now listen closely. I'm going to use a funny word. I kind of made it up. Right here is where so many Christian-y, in quote, Christian-y people collapse and they lose it, okay? Christian-y. That means people who are around Christian things. They grow up around Christian things, okay? And they kind of marry something that seems Christian, but then they all starts to falter and fall apart. Now, let me explain that to you real quick. All right, here's how it works. There's two 20-somethings, and they've been raised in a quasi-Judeo-Christian environment, so they know they want to marry somebody who professes Christ. And so they go around to all the churches in Southern California till they find the church that professes Christ, which has all the hottest-looking people of the opposite sex, right? The big youth groups. And you did this, you know you did. And then you go there, and then you meet them. And you go, ooh, and you do fluttery eyes, and the guy looks at you, he's like, hey, what's up, you know? And then there's this big moment that happens. And you start to date, you start to get to know one another, and everyone's excited for you, right? And you're in a church context where now you're engaged, and you like being around it because everyone's your friends, and they all want to celebrate you, and they all come to your parties, and they're all your matrons and maids of honor, and they all stand with you to be best man, and you know you got to stay in the church because you need the church and the wedding and the pastor to be able to pull that thing off, right? Because if you leave the church, you have no pastor, and if you leave the church, you got no building, and so you stick around. But then all of a sudden, after you walk down the aisle, you walk back out, you show up a few times kind of smiling and glowing to show everyone what it's like to be married, and then all of a sudden you get pregnant. God blesses you with your first child, and here's what happens. All the time, all of a sudden, they start to disappear. Because what they've been taught is now that you're having a baby, you got to drive as far as you possibly can to get a house. And all of a sudden, are you ready? About the time baby's born, a little after, church becomes an appendage. Not the center of the existence, but an appendage. You know what I'm saying? Discipleship group? Maybe, I don't know, coming to church once every third or fourth Sunday when we can kind of get there. It's a long drive and the baby's crying in that nursery. Every time we put them in there, someone comes home sick. And when the first one gets sick, the second one gets sick, my wife gets sick, and I get sick. Serving in ministry, kind of an appendage. Now, here's the problem, friends. Listen closely. By the age of 2, guess what little Johnny understands about mama and dada? Church and Jesus is an appendage. See, because you don't have 18 years. You got about 5. Everyone always think I got 18 years. You got 18, you got 5. Because that little Johnny is growing up, looking around, and he's watching who? To set his bar. He's watching you. And what you allow, he'll embrace. Turn with me real quick, if you would, to Luke. Would you turn back there with me to Luke and look at the words of Jesus? And if you can't make it there in time, I'll read it for you, so don't feel pressure, but try to get to Luke 6. And if you don't know Luke 6, that's Luke's rendition of the Sermon on the Mount, right? So here you have Jesus, and he's standing on the plain of Sea of Galilee, the hillside. And then there's this moment he stands out. He pulls his 12 guys, his new disciples, down the hill. And then the Pharisees are there, and all the crowds are there. And there's this big, kingdom manifesto moment. You all heard that. And then he preaches a lot of the basics that you've all heard before, I'm sure. Being poor in spirit, mourning your sin, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, right? All those things. But look at the part we often miss. This little parable he stuffs in Luke 6. Look at verse 39 here. Look at this. And probably it was longer, and Luke gives us the summary version. But in verse 39, he says, and he, meaning Jesus, spoke a parable. And I need you to picture in your mind the big crowd and then the Pharisees who roll up in their tassels, phylacteries, and all their big gowns, and they're standing there with their arms crossed. And Jesus pauses his sermon, and he applies it. In verse 39, and he says, a blind man, and you can picture it, just go ahead and picture this. Jesus is preaching, right? And then he stops and he goes, oh, and he looks over at these guys. A blind man, keep going, can't guide a blind man, can he? Won't they both fall into a pit? And everyone's like, yeah, good analogy, that's true. Blind man leading a blind man, they're all falling in the pit. Jesus looks over at the Pharisees one more time, and then he looks back at the crowd, and he asks, or actually he lays down a truism. Verse 40. And a pupil is not above his teacher. And by the way, the word teacher there, everyone would have known who he was talking about. He's talking about them. Those 14 dudes standing over there. And notice the generality. A pupil is not above his teacher, but everyone, this is a truism for life, it's proverbial, after he has been fully trained, will be just like his what? Meaning that if you have someone in your life who's doing the discipling, and you've got someone in your life you're looking up to for 12, 13, 14 years, guess what? That's your bar. Can you write something in the margin there real quick? And don't ever forget this your whole life. This is one of those takeaways you always want to remember. It cannot happen through you until it happens to you as a parent. It's not going to happen through you. You're not going to transform the life of your child unless it's happening to you. It's got to be your world view. So let me go ahead real quick here and just kind of tell you the best way to raise a little humanist. I wanted you to be able to leave today with something that you could always remember, my encouragement for you. Here's how you raise a little humanist. I know everyone here came this morning. That's what you wanted. It's what you wanted. You came for that. You're leaning in right now. I always wanted to know how to raise someone who would go off and become agnostic or atheist and would believe in Darwinian evolution and then kind of hate everything that I ever stood for when I was raising them. Okay, so I wanted to give you the way you can do that. Okay, here it is. Ready? Just keep being a Sunday Christian. Just keep showing up once every third week. And don't have discipleship, and keep just kind of leave family devotions to once a month whenever you feel the pressure rolling in. And make sure you keep hitting all those Sunday baseball games. And make sure all weekend, all they ever see is the NFL football games. You just keep doing that. And you keep them plugged in to that 5-day-a-week humanist machine called state school. Oh, and then, by the way, you're going to send off the best little humanist product over to Berkeley or one of these Ivy League schools where you can drop $150,000 to put them around all the other humanists and then with the teachers who are humanists, and you are going to have one rock-solid, world-changing humanist. That's how you do it. That's not determinism. Jesus can save anybody he wants to save. He saved a lot of us out of that system. But the odds right now are about 90%. Move on to the next one. The parents, with the core curriculum of God, must maintain a biblical worldview for themselves. When our kids are growing up, they're going, man, my mommy and daddy, they take church seriously. They take God seriously. They take the gospel seriously. They live and they eat and they breathe Jesus. But then look at verse 7. The parents must not only maintain that biblical worldview, they also have to instruct it. They got to pour it down on their kids. Look at verse 7. And you shall teach them diligently to your sons. And you're going to talk of them when you sit in your house. Talk of what? The love for the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. When you sit down in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. So you could write this down. Step number 2, back in Deuteronomy 6, to ensuring curriculum hits our kids is you have to teach them diligently. And the Hebrew word right there means to be sharp with your teaching. Like carving on a piece of wood, you're carving on their mind a biblical worldview. Day in and day out. In the evening and in the morning. And all day long, you're carving into their mind a biblical worldview. And you can see all the various contexts for it. Look at it in verse 7 there. A formal setting. He says when you're sitting down, like homeschooling where the biblical worldview permeates all the instruction. The informal setting, when you're walking by the way, what Paul would later call nathesia, it was a classical Greek word that he pulls over. Aristotle used it about exerting influence on the mind, meaning when you're hearing music, when you're going to see sports, when you're watching entertainment, you're always exerting a biblical worldview over and filtering it through their mind when they're living life. And then he says, in the evening. He says, look, lying down, your family meals and worship and praying before bed. And by the way, did you know that only 1% of evangelical families now do family worship at night 3 to 4 times a week and then catechize their children? Only 1%. And then look, he says in the morning, when you rise up, and each day started in the word and prayer, it's part of the routine. I mean, really what he's saying is that when the kids get up and they walk outside of their room and they're wiping the sleep out of their eyes, the very first thing that they should see is mom and dad have already been awake, they've already been in the word, they've already been in prayer, and that literally is the foundation for their life. Because learning is caught, not taught. Learning is 89% visual, so what you are is what they will see, and what they see is ultimately 90% of the time what they will become. There's a lot of gray-haired guys in the room, and some guys who are balding as well, so I don't want to pick on gray hairs. There's both. Older men, my age and older. There are some men around the room that even as I'm preaching, I'm watching them nodding their head. And you have some gentlemen in this room right now who, if they could, because of what's happened in their life, would walk right up here on this stage, if they were allowed and it wasn't out of social disorder, they'd walk up on this stage and they would look at all the young people in this church, because we have a church, a lot of young people, and you know what they would say? They would say, listen to this. Because it's too late for them. They bought into it. Hook, line, and sinker like we all did. You put your 2 little tykes in the preschool or whatever, and then you go work the double jobs. We're going to get the big house. We'll drive the 2 cars. We'll all work out the education stuff sometime, and we'll get them down to the youth ministry. It's all going to work itself out. And they will tell you they remember the very day that preteen walked home and walked into their house and looked at him and they said, hey, how's it going? What'd you do today? And then all of a sudden it was no longer the little guy who used to fish with them. It was not the little gal who used to go out and shoot hoops with her daddy. She looked at him and she said, it was fine. And then she threw the hoodie up. She walked down the hallway. She pulled out her phone. She slammed the door. And he said, and I lost my little girl that day. And I've not had her back. And if they could, these men would take you by the collar as a young man, and they would say, listen, you get one chance. You get one. And you don't get till 18. You get till about age 5. And then the cement has set. And they grieve it they grieve it. Psalm 1:1, how blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in that law he meditates day and night. Romans 12:2, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. 2 Corinthians 10:5, and we are taking every thought, every ideology captive to the obedience of Christ. Part of being a Christian parent is that for 12 years you say every single thought, every ideology is going to be taken captive to the obedience of Christ. And we're going to meditate on the law of God day and night. What you do with that when you leave, that's between you and him. But that's what we do in this home, which is actually where he goes in verse 8. Look at this. The parents must maintain the biblical worldview. The parents must instruct the biblical worldview. But then look at the last one, verse 8. The parents actually are the ones inside those four walls who must protect the biblical worldview. You see that in verse 8? He says, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead, and you will write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And everyone in here probably can picture an Orthodox Jew, when they wear the little box on their forehead and the phylacteries, right? They took this really literally, but that's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is there needs to be an obvious marking of your territory for the glory of God. And he literally outlines it. Anything that his hands touch, anything these eyes look at, anything that comes in the home, anything that goes out of the home, all of it's going to glorify God. And oh, by the way, if you want, let your eyes glance down to verse 10 to 15. He clarifies why. So that when you enter all the temptation and the prosperity, you don't start looking like all of them. What he's saying is, Pops, it's your job. Anything that comes inside those four walls, it's got to glorify God. Okay, I'm going to tell you a funny story. So I'm going to tell you which kid, but I have one kid that we were having a really, really tough talk with, and he kind of said, "Whoa, I think I should be able to, X, Y, and Z." And I very kindly and gently just walked over to the door, and I said, "Well, go for it." I opened the door. And said, there's the world. But as for what happens in this home, now the part of the story I didn't tell you is he was only like 7. But I wanted him to know what? As long as you're living under this roof, this is the authority and this is the contract. When you're big enough to pay your bills and put your own roof over your head, you go do it. And I'll pray for you. But to quote Joshua, as for me and my house, what? I'm going to serve the Lord. This right here, verse 8, should cinch it for all of us parents. For a brief time, God gives you and I stewardship of this little life, right? Who remembers our last 3 weeks, right? Psalm 139, he wove them together, he made them. Psalm 127, verse 3, he places them into your home. Mark chapter 10, Jesus says, they belong to me, the little ones. And then Matthew chapter 19, anybody who dares cause them distress or trouble should just tie a big rock around his neck and go jump in the lake and kill himself. So literally, he says, here's this little one, a stewardship given to you. Your job is to protect them and not expose them to any danger or evil, and that's the mommy and daddy's job. And by the way, that's what we as Christians are to do. The pagans do the opposite. They take their little babies, and then they offer them on the altars of sacrifice to pagan gods. That's what Israel was about to go into. You remember Moloch, where there's this statue, and it would sit there above the fire, and they would take their babies and they would put them in his hands, and then as they began to melt, the babies would curl up into a little ball, and then they would melt and drop down into the fire. And by the way, if you go with us to Israel, I'll show you where this actual altar is. We know where it is. But it still happens today. Professing Christians still offer their children on the altar of convenience, the altar of entertainment, the altar of legislation, the altar of, well, Joe Biden told me to go to that school, so I guess that's what I got to do. And the church's job, Mission Bible, is to resource you so that you understand the calling of being a parent and gives you all the resources so that you can fulfill the beautiful calling of being a parent. Because there's nothing more beautiful, friends, nothing more beautiful, everyone knows this, than a marriage that's in God, and kids who end up in God, and grandkids who end up in God, so that when you're breathing your very last breath, the last thought on your mind is my kids and my lineage and my ancestry behind me are all one day going to join me to be with God. I mean, come on, let's just be honest. When you're laying there, let's just talk about death for a second. When you're laying there and you got the beeping machine and you can't even move and everything's just kind of black and all you're hearing is dude, 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 and you got 8 minutes left to your life. You're not going to be thinking about the car you drove. You're not going to be thinking about the Ivy League schools. You're not going to be thinking about how fancy in social studies and in history your kids were. The only thing that's going to be on your mind is, did little Johnny know Christ? Did little Emily and Sally Mae know Jesus? Did I do everything that I could to leave a legacy unto His glory and for their good? That's all that's going to be going through your mind when you get prepared to see Christ in glory. Is there going to be a lineage of people that I love that are coming with me? You're not going to care if you taught them math. You're not going to care if they learn Mozart. All you're going to care about is whether they know the Messiah, Christ. So listen, friends, if you're here and you're like me and you're getting up in years and you're a grandparent, or you're one of those who lived in the public school world for a long time and you're watching your kids and your grandkids and they've went askew, listen to me, there's hope. Jesus can rescue them the way that He rescued all of us. And if you're here and you're a single mother and you're going, how in the world am I ever going to do this? Listen, there's hope because all things are possible with God. But for everybody else, if you're hearing this for the first time, let me just go ahead and put one thing kind of in front of you that puts it all together. And this is math. This isn't theology or ideology. This is just math. I'm not good at math. That's for Dean. Pastor Dean does all that. But this is just a little bit of math. Okay, you ready? You get and I get 14,000 seat hours in school. Did you know that? By the way, Joe Biden wants to bump it up to 16,000. So by the time your child is 5 until they graduate, they get 14,000 hours in school. Now let's just do the math on that. You get 8 hours per day of sleep. You get 8 hours per day in school. You get another 2 hours for give or take for homework, depending on what kind of child you have. You get 2 hours in there for eating and bathing, again, depending on how clean your child is. Maybe an hour in there for travel. And you know what that totals right there? 23 hours. That's no extracurricular. That's just a regular day. Now listen to me. That's not ideology and theology. That's just math. That 1 hour a day when you supposedly are going to win them with their worldview cannot compete with the 23 others. See, children in the public school system are ultimately a ward of the state. And when you take little Johnny and you have him go off all day to be trained by humanists, don't be shocked when one day he comes home as a humanist.